Thank you guys for coming. This is really exciting for me to be with all of you guys. I want you to get whatever is most valuable for you out of this presentation. I've kept it a little bit general, so you should feel free to ask whatever specific questions you have. Ask me to slow down if I'm talking too quickly, or speed up if I'm not talking quickly enough. And I wanted to ask, first of all, if any of you guys had any questions from the presentation the other day? Maybe? No? Yes? No? Okay, cool. So this talk that I have just a brief presentation on some of the projects that we've done at CNN. Just a sampling because, like for instance, in my office in Washington, D.C., we have 450 people. So we do a lot of projects every day. So this is just a small sample, but then I also brought the Excel spreadsheets that I can share with you guys. So what I was hoping we would do is do the presentation, and then I have the spreadsheets that you guys can play around with if you'd like. And then also I have some raw data that I was thinking that we could look through together. So that's how I envision this going. But like I said, stop me, ask questions, interrupt, don't be shy. And I don't think we have audio, so I have like 1 or 2 videos, but we'll play them from here, and then if you can hear them, great, and if not, I'll sort of tell you what they say. So for us, every story starts with a question, right? And I think that's the great part of being a journalist, is that you get to be curious. You get to start every day saying, I wonder why this is, or what could this be, what are we missing? So obviously in the United States, we've had a number of big policy changes under President Trump. One of them is immigration. So we're now on the 3rd version of this travel ban. And these are the countries that currently are affected under this ban. And the reason for the ban is national security, right? The stated reason is that we're worried about people from these countries coming in. That's what the administration says. And so when we were looking at this story, we were asking, what are we thinking about when we think about what's going on with this ban, you know? Hi, good morning. And so our question was, is there a national security concern for people from these countries specifically? And so we looked at ISIS arrests, because ISIS arrests are Al-Qaeda is sort of on the wane, right? Al-Qaeda is not as relevant as ISIS. And ISIS arrests are sort of interesting because ISIS really only came around in like 2014. They haven't been around that long. So we started looking at how many arrests came from people in these countries. And so sometimes you just have to find the right question. Because the reality is, and we talked a little bit about this yesterday, good morning. We talked about there's just so much information out there, right? So sometimes the most important thing is to start with a good question, you know? Hey, no worries, come on. Because you don't want to have too much information to look through, right? I mean, you do this all the time too, right? Like you don't want to start with a question that's too big.
You have to narrow it down.
You have to narrow it down because, I mean, otherwise you're spending all day long just not finding anything specific, right? So for this question, this is what we said. We said there have been no domestic ISIS attacks carried out by individuals from the travel ban countries. But does this mean that the policy has reduced domestic terror threat? That's our question. it's a policy that impacts a lot of people, both in the US and around the world, we want to know, is it going to keep Americans safe, right? So since 1975, there's been no terror attack that costs lives on US soil by someone from the original travel ban countries. But we looked to say, okay, so maybe there's still a threat, even though nobody was killed, right? So what about the arrests? So we looked at 114 people since 2014. So that's our data set. That's kind of manageable, 114 cases, right? And so then we want to know a couple of things. We want to know where those people were from, what they were charged with, right? So this is good news for us because this is data that's really available. The US government wants to tell us about this data because this is the US government doing what they're supposed to do, right? This is not data that they're hiding because sometimes the question is maybe the data you're looking for, someone has a reason not to share it. But in this case, no, the US government wants to share this data because they're keeping Americans safe. They're making arrests. They're saying these people were dangerous and we arrested them. So we started just looking at what they were telling us. Texas man, 10 years in prison. North Carolina man, 243 months in prison. 15 years. Illinois man, 40 months. So my video is upside down for some reason. I don't really know why. But this is, oh, there it goes. Let's see if I can get it to play. Can you guys hear that?
The library was approached about to find a way to help organize information different states and states for insurance. So Lisa and I began to compile and build this spreadsheet. And we used solely primary source material, mainly press releases from the Department of Justice. As there wasn't an exact goal or deadline in mind for the project, so we just kind of picked at it and took our time adding columns of demographics such as gender, age, state where they were arrested, the plea they entered, sentencing information, things like that. We even color-coded different sections to highlight connections with the individuals. And then this year, the person who originally asked us to keep up with the spreadsheets left the company. And so Lisa and I met to evaluate its purpose and its scope. And we wanted to look at ways to incorporate the information that we already had in the current events. And we noticed that every person who was arrested was originally from the U.S. And that one developed into our story, which was published in October on how it relates to traveling. So we created additional columns of data to include country of origin, status. So it's continued to form and evolve over time. And then just this morning, Lisa published a story on one of the arrestees based on court documents that she gathered for the spreadsheet. So we are still active with the spreadsheet as we see the info still incredibly relevant, especially considering the recent ITC's higher vehicle attack in New York. And we hope to continue to pull data from the spreadsheet as a way to supplement additional stories in the future.
So we have a big team at CNN, and so when I was thinking about putting together this presentation, I wanted to talk to my colleagues because I edit things. Hey, no worries. I edit things, but hey, how's it going? But a lot of the content that I'm talking about with you guys, I didn't actually produce myself. I edited it, so I made sure it was correct. But when I was coming to talk about it, I was like, oh man, I want to make sure that I talk to my colleagues before I'm just sharing their work. And so these colleagues, I asked them, they said, do you want me to send an email explaining how I did all of this? And I was like, no, it'd be really cool if we did a video. And so they shot a little video explaining how this came to be. And I think that's kind of cool because like I'm so excited that I get to be here with you guys. But like you should know too that like there's a whole lot of my colleagues at CNN who are also really excited to be sharing their work with you guys too. So there's a big community and network out there, and I hope that you guys will take this conference as the starting point for a lot of conversations going forward. But the other point with this database is that sometimes what happens is you have a question, or really you just think that some information might be important in the future. And so almost like, I don't know, a little squirrel collecting acorns before the winter, you start collecting data, and you don't really know what you're going to do with it, but you just start collecting it. So actually, this database that we use to tell these stories about the travel ban, ISIS arrests, we started many years ago when ISIS first appeared on the scene because we thought, you know, ISIS may start making big attacks in the United States. And if they do, we want to be sure we have all of that data ready to go. There's not a lot of time that we have information to go. And actually, ISIS has not proven to be that deadly in the United States, which is really good news. But it turns out that data became relevant to us in a different way. So I think that's a really great lesson for all of us. Just if there's something that you sort of think is interesting, like save it, because you don't know what you might do with it later, right? Does anybody have any questions so far? No? Did anybody like the squirrel analogy? Does that work? Yes?
Who decides what kind of the data you will start to collect? There is a certain kind of decision by somebody, or people individually, like a journalist and research teams, say it might be, and it's their almost kind of volunteer contribution to the work, or
right.
How their decision making is happening?
So my colleague here, CNN is lucky in that we have a whole research staff. So we have, it's not a huge research staff, but we have 5 research librarians. And that sounds like kind of a lot, but we have like 4,000 editorial employees. So our research librarians get asked a lot of requests. But what she was explaining was that what happened was one of our colleagues in Washington said, hey, he covers like crime and justice, and he said, hey, I think ISIS is going to be a big deal. Can you start collecting this information? But then what happened was he actually left the company. He's like now traveling through Latin America. He was like, I'm done. This is really stressful. So he actually initiated this project, but the project outlives him. But I think one of the things that's cool about a big organization like CNN, and I think some of you all may also work with big institutions, is that you can contribute to like what the big institution is doing, right? But then you can also do things on the side, because you can also find areas where you're interested in it, and maybe you don't know quite yet. Like the example I gave in my presentation about the FBI statistics on rape. Nobody asked me to look at that data, but it was like this thing that I was sort of like, that's interesting. I wonder what's there. So I think it can be both, you know. But if the network decides that it's a priority, then obviously there's a lot more resources because we are a big group. Yeah, good question. But sometimes like, so that example was like something that we have spent years working on, right? But like this is the most recent election, the big election that we had in the United States was we had 2 governors of 2 states elected recently, New Jersey and Virginia. And these are big elections because they are some of the first indications that can tell us about how Donald Trump's presidency is impacting what we call down ballot candidates. So these are candidates for smaller races, right? So Virginia was a big election because Virginia is a state that is kind of liberal and kind of conservative. Sometimes it votes for Democrats, sometimes it votes for Republicans. And so everyone was watching to see, are they going to vote for the Democratic candidate or are they going to vote for the Republican candidate? Well, it turned out that the Democratic candidate won in Virginia. And so this was a situation where we needed data immediately to tell us more about what this election meant. Because people care somewhat about Ralph Northam, kind of. But who here has heard of Ralph Northam, right? Anyone?
Yes.
You're American?
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. But who here cares about Donald Trump? Like a few more people, right? So like what the data is going to tell us is what the relationship is between this guy Ralph Northam and Donald Trump. So the good news about election data is that election data in the United States is really easy to come by. It's published online pretty quickly after the election. And so this, this just tells us what the raw percentages were statewide. So you can see it was a pretty wide margin. But actually what we're interested in is not so much what happened statewide. We want to know what happened in these individual districts. And what we're really interested in is the difference between how the Democratic governor did versus the Democratic president. Does anybody have an idea why we care about that? Like why would that matter in terms of data? Does that make sense? Like why we would look at that?
Capture the shift. What is the shift, please?
Exactly. So if, for instance, the Republican candidate did better or the same as Trump, that tells us something about how Trump is doing. Because the thing is, in the United States, we only vote for president every 4 years, right? And we don't have a mechanism to recall a president. There is no such vote. And so the only thing that can tell us, for instance, because there's polls, right? But famously, polls have problems. Did anybody look at polls before the 2016 election? Yeah. So, hey, how's it going? Hey, no worries. Welcome. We're talking about polling data. But did anybody did anybody look at polling data before the 2016 election? Like, what did polling data say before the 2016 election?
That Hillary Clinton was going to.
That Hillary Clinton was going to win, right? I mean, like, all the way to, like, election night, right? The articles were like, it's Hillary's to lose. Trump is definitely on his way to defeat. Like, all of these, because the polls had this issue, right? So, we have polling data, but the only thing that matters is what people do on election day. That's the only thing that matters. There's only one election, right? So that's why we care about this. So you can see, what's interesting is, and I'll show you some charts. What's interesting is that it was kind of mixed as it related to Trump and Gillespie. Gillespie was the Republican candidate for governor. But as it relates to Clinton, what's interesting is that you'll see the Democratic candidate for governor did so much better than Hillary Clinton did. So it tells us something not just about Trump, but for the Democrats, as they're thinking about who they want to run in 2020, it tells them something about the kind of candidates they need to be looking at if they want to win a place like Virginia. So that's why this data is really interesting. So, but obviously, spreadsheets are really hard to look at. I don't like looking at spreadsheets. Does anybody here like spreadsheets? You do?
Yeah.
You have to tell me your secrets. I hate spreadsheets. I understand they're so useful, but I don't like looking at them. You guys are gonna have to like come and help me with that portion of it because like spreadsheets are like. But anyway, so this is a tool that is free that you can just input your data into, and it gives you a much more friendly kind of. I think is this a video too? Yeah. So you'll see. So this is just you can input your data here, It's a free software. It's a free website. And it gives you just a much better idea just from glimpsing at it. It's an infographic. It's a tool. And you can see, so this is Gillespie versus Trump. This is showing how he did better and worse. And this is Northam, the candidate. This one's sort of hard to look at. But you can see here just the difference in how these two candidates did versus their respective presidential candidates. So once you have that kind of data, then you can also write stories really easily. Because some people are going to want to look at the infographics, but obviously journalists like to write. And some journalists really like to make analysis. So this is one of my colleagues, Chris Saliza. Does anybody read Chris Saliza? Stefan does? So Chris is one of our political commentators at CNN. If you're interested in reading about American politics, no kidding, he writes 3 articles a day. I sit next to him in our newsroom in DC before I was in Atlanta, and I was just reading, and I was saying, oh my God, this guy writes so much. And really, like, he comes into the office, he puts on his headphones, writes, gets on TV, comes back down, writes. He really writes 3 columns a day. It's amazing. So anyway, so this was the piece that he wrote based on the data that we got out of Virginia. And so his takeaway is Trump was the big loser. Because remember, like, that's why people are interested in the data. Not because they're interested in Northam or Gillespie. They're interested in what it means for Trump. And so Liz's takeaway is Trump was the loser. He was the loser because the suburbs of Richmond and the exurbs of Washington, D.C., exurbs are like further away than the suburbs. Republican Ed Gillespie ran far behind the recent past GOP gubernatorial nominees and even behind Trump himself. So that's his takeaway. So sometimes, like with election data, the trends can be a little bit obvious. But then sometimes you have this data that you have to, there's a little bit more to it than just how people voted. Did they vote for a Democrat or did they vote for a Republican? That data is pretty obvious. You know exactly what it means, right? But sometimes you have this data that you have to think about a little bit more. So the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, is an important agency in the United States. They keep our water clean. They worry about air quality. They, until recently, were working on regulating carbon dioxide emissions. The mission has changed under the Trump administration. But one of the things that journalists have looked at is the travel schedule for the head of this agency, Scott Pruitt. And one of the reasons that journalists have looked at this is because it's public money, right? So that's one of the projects that I think is critical for journalists to always look at, is how public money is spent. I was talking to some of our colleagues here who are from Armenia, and they're working on a similar project to just explain, like, where does public money get spent? I mean, that's critical, right? Like, this is a really important question. So what we did was we got a lot of information about this guy's travel. So these are all meetings, or you can see this is a media interview, this is a call, this is a tour, cabinet call, media meeting with Oklahoma legislatures call. And so what we had to do with this data was this took a lot longer to get into than, say, the election data. Because the election data, the state election board publishes it, and then you just grab it from the website. This stuff we got in a really raw form, and we had to put it into the spreadsheet. So the other thing that we had to do when we got around to writing a story was we had to figure out, like, how do we classify some of this? So this was our takeaway, which was kind of a little quirky. Prefers meetings with Republicans, just not on Mondays, because it turned out that he didn't travel a whole lot on Mondays. But we had a whole lot of data around that because, again, this is public money and we want to know how it's spent. It turns out that he travels home to his state, Oklahoma, a lot. Somewhat more than other past administrators. Hi. That's the end of my PowerPoint presentation. I tried to choose like 3 different examples of how we collect data and how we use data. Now what I was thinking that we could do for the rest of the time is like really get into the spreadsheets if you guys want. Look at some other examples of some data that still hasn't had a lot of stories written about it, but I think could. Or we can talk more broadly about questions that you guys have.
May I just ask you in the last example?
Yeah.
In last example, let's say this data you found them open sources online, or you needed to ask somebody for them. Who get it to you? Was that leaked or somehow?
So with that data, I believe that was a Freedom of Information request. So that data was not published online, but it was data that we were legally entitled to. Because, so in the US, for federal government data, it falls under what's called a Freedom of Information Act. And maybe my husband can talk more about that because he's the lawyer. But basically what that means is the data may not, the tricky thing about some of this information is that you kind of have to know it's there, right? And so you kind of have to know what you're asking for. And so in this case, we knew to ask for travel data because there was already some hint that there might be something interesting in that data. Because, I mean, in the US, the federal government is so big, you would make yourself crazy asking for all their data about whatever it was. But that data, I believe, we did ask for. And the other thing is there's a lot of NGOs in the U.S., and this is like, I think there's probably NGOs around the world that do this too, which they go around filing these requests and then tell journalists, hey, this data is available. And some of the data that I brought is from a FOIA, we call it FOIA, Freedom of Information Request, that was asked for by an NGO, not a journalistic organization. But then the New York Times has written from it. So once the data is there, then you can just use it, which is great. Yeah.
And do you have the difficulties in getting the public information, kind of in terms of timing or in terms of the scale of information that you ask for?
Yeah. Yeah, some of it can be very responsive, and some of it, there was this interesting thing recently. I don't know if you guys saw this, but the JFK assassination files. Did you guys see this? So, like, there was lots of that information that was withheld for years and years and years, and it was finally released. Yeah. Of course, a lot of it is what we call redacted. It's. But interestingly, in that data set, we wrote a story about this. There was a secret FBI report on the surveillance they did on Martin Luther King, which is really interesting because it said nothing about JFK, not a thing. But it had a lot of weird stuff about Martin Luther King, including some weird allegations that the FBI made about his sex life.
Yeah.
It's really weird. So sometimes, like, you look at data and you say, like, why is this included? Sometimes it's like, what's missing? Sometimes it's like, why is this in here? So I think those are always like the questions that are almost sometimes more interesting than what's in the data itself. Sort of like, what's around it? Yeah.
Regarding the polls, I was going to ask. There was a talk, or like there's an opinion that when journalists report too much on the polls, it can influence actually the elections, right? Because maybe some Clinton voters would not go thinking that it's already there, and Trump voters on vice versa. So, what's your take on that? And also, do you think we should be, as journalists, explaining all the uncertainty behind the polls and how to make it interesting?
I think it's super important that we explain the uncertainty around polling. I think it's really, really important. Do you guys know like what that refers to? Like sometimes you see polls and it'll be like +/3 or whatever, right? Yeah. So I don't know. Like, do you guys do polling here in Georgia?
Yeah.
Yeah. How do you report on it when you report on it?
We just say that this source, we have to name the source. So who does the poll, and then what it says, and sometimes we do a test and just see what they think about the
Yeah.
But the question is, should we try all the polls in reality? Whether we don't have this certainty,
Yeah.
how they work in methodology, and do you have the same problem?
Yeah, I mean, not all polls are created equal, right? I mean, like an internet poll is like the worst poll, right? Because it's like an opt-in. So the only people who are participating in an internet poll are the ones that are motivated to do so. So they're the ones that have the strongest opinion. You also want to have a big sample size, you know. But I think the question about like, that's something I struggle with, because it's like, you want to tell a good story, but then sometimes you get a little bit bogged down, because then you have to say plus minus sample size of 1,025 registered voters, you know. And I mean, what we do at CNN is we do it in a graphic. So on the TV it'll say, like, you know, it'll say plus minus, you know, whatever, and then online you can click through and get, you know, the full report, which will say exactly who we polled and, you know, all of this kind of stuff.
So you're describing it, yeah?
Yeah, we describe it. Yeah. But I think that the other problem is that...
Interpretation?
Well, I think the audience doesn't really know what that means.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So if
So what does this number mean?
Exactly. So if the polling is Clinton 54, Trump, you know, 40, whatever.
Sometimes you have to compare to the previous one just to know the context of the
If there's been movement.
yeah.
But see, the thing is, like, if you just say like +/3, I don't think people realize.
What the
Yeah, and the other thing that we'll say a lot is like it's within the margin of error. But I don't think people really, right? I don't think people really follow what that means. All they want to know is their candidate going to win or lose? Right?
Yes.
I mean, like when I talk to people now, like, you know, they're like, all we want to know is Trump going to get impeached or not? And I'm like, I don't know. Like that's really, you know. But I mean, that's what people want to know from news. They want some sort of certainty. And like, I think the point with polls is that perhaps the point with polls is that polls give more certainty than actually exists, right?
Or they read into it. The poll is, and then of course that affects their voting pattern.
You think so?
President Trump was CNN to blame, you know, and the others, all the left-wing press, and saying, you know, oh, it's going to be Hillary for president. Oh, I don't need to vote. Hillary's going to get in, and sure enough.
But it wasn't just media on the on
course.
it was all media.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Of course. But of course that has an influence. We don't know how much. And actually, I've got a question sort of related to this. Going back to your Virginia governor election piece, which is, I'm looking at that and thinking of confounding factors and how you control for them, because, you know, talking to, you know, American voters here in Tbilisi, wondering last November how they were going to vote, and saying, you know, effectively, I don't like either of them.
Right.
Was actually a standard answer. So
right.
I'm looking at that thinking, is the headline, you know, now Hillary's out the picture, the Democrats coming up again,
well.
you know, rather than it being about Trump, or maybe it's the individuals in that particular race. Forget the big picture, because this does happen. I'm sure you've reported on that when you've got a shock result because there's one candidate who the public in that area really gets behind. So how do you control for those confounding factors rather than it just being a because I'm looking at that and
Right.
I'm challenging that when I see it, when I see
Yeah.
the numbers you present to me.
Well, I mean, I think you should tweet it to Crystal Izza as well. No, I mean, like, that's a really, like, do y'all follow that question? It's a really good question, and I think that's where data can help us, but you're right, I mean, like, there's a lot of different ways to look at the data, right?
Yeah, because I love that headline. Oh, I love that headline. That, to me, personally, is very satisfying to read. But, the amateur or semi-professional statistician looks at it and goes, there are some other things here. I want to see that those factors have been controlled for. And I'm wondering how far you dig in to the data to find that story. Was it about the local guy?
So I think that's a really excellent question, and the thing, so I think Chris is very talented, but you'll notice here, like it says, analysis.
Yeah, it's color, yeah.
Right. So if I'm editing, and I did not edit this piece in full disclosure, but if I'm editing a piece that doesn't say analysis and that has this headline, you're right, I'm asking those same questions. I'm saying, are we reaching here? Because there's all kinds of factors. The candidates were, of course, their own creatures, right? I mean,
yes.
They had some relationship to Trump, and the Democrat didn't have to deal with Clinton at all, as you say. There was a race in Georgia, the Georgia 6. That was it was supposed to be a bellwether race before this. Do y'all know what this term bellwether means? It means basically like a canary in the coal mine, almost like something that is going to tell us about something else. So there was a congressional race in Georgia. Do you remember this one? Georgia 6? So the candidate who was running was like 31, the Democrat. He went to high school with my friends. He was like very young, had no resume, and he lost very badly to a Republican. And so then everybody was drawing conclusions from that race too. In that race, it was the opposite. It was Trump's great, Trump's in a good position, right? So you're right. I mean, the difference between a straight-up news piece and an analysis piece, I think, is in a headline like that or a conclusion like that.
Yeah, because the public wants to read a nice, simple statement like that, not here are 3 factors, all of which had an effect on this.
Or a plus-minus sample size.
Yeah. Error margins.
Because I commiserate with that because our worlds are really complicated. Right?
Yeah.
I think so. I think our worlds are really complicated. I mean, I got on a plane, and 18 hours later, I'm in a country I've never been in before, and I'm looking at an alphabet that I don't understand, and I'm trying to figure out, what is this delicious food? And, I mean, our worlds are really complicated. And so sometimes we just want a really simple, and I'm like, oh, it's a dumpling. I don't even know what else it is. It's a dumpling. It's delicious. It's Kinkali, I guess, but it's oh, it's a dumpling, So, I mean, that's a simple example, but our lives are complicated, so I get why people want something simple.
So is there a way, it seems like a lot of, especially for this last presidential election, it really mattered how the candidate is making people feel.
Yeah.
It's very a visceral, emotional thing. Where I went to university was in the middle of the U.S. in Wisconsin, a state that, like Virginia, sometimes votes Republican, sometimes Democrat.
Yeah.
And people really weren't excited about Hillary Clinton. The last few presidential elections, they voted Democrat, but she didn't really appeal to blue collar workers, where former manufacturing, places like that. And she never even came there, and she lost. So is there a way, maybe if data could better capture, like, oh, how are people in this area feeling about this on a more emotional level? Or,
That's an interesting question. Stefan, what do you think about that?
What was the question?
Can data capture how voters are feeling emotionally?
Yes, but it's much more difficult to quantify.
How would you do it?
What you can do is, so most of what you're looking at when you're talking about polls or just tracking polls, most of what they're trying to do is just, the big question actually isn't whether or not who they support, it's whether or not they're likely to vote, right? It's actually the difficulties in figuring out the group of people that are going to vote, not in determining who they support. Because all polls that are like that are just a projection of who's going to vote on election day, and that's the harder part to figure out. So when you see a bunch of polls that say Hillary +3, and those were actually accurate overall, but you look at the Wisconsin polls and then everyone in Milwaukee decides not to vote, which was not something that could be expected or projected, then the entire poll is wrong. Not because the responses were wrong, but because the pollsters were forming an incorrect voter pool, an incorrect projection of who would vote. Your overall question, which is how do people feel about things, are not captured in polls like that. They're captured in in-depth polls with live callers who call in and ask people specifically what they do. But the reality is that those polls are extremely expensive. And
Like how expensive?
Depends on how big the audience is. We generally spend around $30,000 for a poll like that, and that's for a much smaller district. If you're going to do a statewide poll,
$30,000 for a small poll to try to get a better emotional snapshot of who's actually going to vote.
you need 700 responses to make a decent poll, which seems like very little or maybe a lot, but it's sometimes hard to get them if you need enough questions. So yeah, 30K. You want to do an entire state, you have to 50, 55. You want to do that in the entire country, and you want 7,000 responses, for instance, you're talking about $500,000. I mean, so it's like, it's a difficult game, especially if you want to do it over and over and over again, which is what you need to do. Because the reality is, if you looked at all those polls, and if you looked at the question, one of the key questions in a lot of those polls is, when did you make your decision? Right? And what you saw in a lot of the presidential polls, which is sort of unusual, is people making their decision in the last 7 days. So even if you polled, like did an in-depth poll 10 days out, you would have missed that movement. So that's really sort of a hard thing to do. So the question is, yes, you can get it. It's difficult to quantify, which is why most people use like focus groups at the beginning, so they can sort of predict the way people are thinking based on the secondary inputs.
And what's a focus group?
Focus group. Thank you for asking. A focus group is basically you get a bunch of people in a room who you think are representative voters, and you start asking them questions and trying to get out information that they care about. So let's say one of your demographics that you're concerned about is people with 2 kids that are in between the ages of 40 and 45. You get a bunch of them in a room, by a bunch I mean like 8, and you have a moderator actually pull out the way they feel about things. And she say like, and so the chief question, and I'm actually going to talk about this in my workshop later today. One of the chief questions that this has been asked since 1930 is a version of, do you think we're on the right track or the wrong track, right? And what you're trying to get there is whether or not they have a good feeling about the country or about what's going on. And if you can figure that out, then you know how they're going to respond to a bunch of other things. Because if you feel the country's on the wrong track, and then you hit them with a negative, they're much more likely to accept the negative. If they feel the country's on the right track and you hit it with a negative, they might ignore it. And they're much more likely to accept the positive. So if you know where they feel about the country overall, you'll know much more about whether or not they're willing to accept the negative. And then you get more movement later on. So your question really was about the emotional impact, what they're feeling about it. Oh, someone's question, sorry. If you know their initial setup in terms of how they feel about the election or how they feel about general society, then you'll know more about what that emotion is going to attach to. So in the Clinton situation, her untrustworthiness might have been a proxy for the lack of trust in government overall. So if you know that they don't feel trust in government, you know it's much more likely that they're not going to trust the candidate who's representative of the previous president. See what I'm saying?
So that leads into the whole sort of Republican-Democrat brand thing, that I've seen some analysis that says people are basically loyal to the brand, and as the party policies shift, people sort of stick with it and go, oh, that's what I think now. I saw a very interesting Economist piece a few months ago on this. It's sort of like, you know, whether you love Manchester United or Real Madrid, even if they're not doing very well,
Right.
you are still loyal to that brand because it puts simplicity into a complex world. No,
Absolutely.
I'm still a Man U fan, I'm still a Republican, maybe not that combination. And that all feeds in, doesn't it, to the same thing. Okay.
So-
it wasn't my question, it's a very good question, it's very interesting.
Yeah, I tend not to answer the actual question. I answer the one I like to answer. It's just much more efficient for me.
You would be terrible in a focus group.
Would I? But yeah, to your overall point, I mean, there is brand loyalty, and there's sort of a if you describe yourself as a Republican, right? If that's an important part of your identity, and then the party moves, you can choose not to accept part of it, but unless you're willing to change your own identity, which is a much harder thing to do, then it's unlikely. Now, there's a huge argument in the United States right now about whether or not you're seeing party realignment, right? Which is the idea that people are disconnecting their identity from the party because of Donald Trump. And you can argue that the Virginia results are a disconnect. Because what happened in the Virginia results was not like the Democratic base turned out, like a tremendous amount. What you saw was a lot of the voters that Democrats don't traditionally count on, which were like suburban white women, coming over to vote for the Democrat. So if that's the case, and if they're now voting Democrat, then that's a party realignment, at least within that group. And the parties are so finely balanced that if you get a 2 or 3% move, the entire nation switches. So
So
people
you
out of
guys
100.
should both tweet at Chris,
Yeah.
and you can say like, I agree with you, and you can say like, I don't know, Chris, like,
Yeah, I'm not
Really?
professional. I don't think he's going to listen to me very much. I've got a follow-up question to that, then,
Yeah.
which is if you were doing your job, both of you, in say the Netherlands, which is the absolute opposite system, where you might have, 10 parties all, winning seats.
yeah.
Would your methods have to change entirely?
Would my methods have to change entirely?
Both
I would
of
ride
you
my bike
from-
more.
Hmm?
Your question is as a definition of party, if there are more parties, would I have to change my method? Yes, because
Yeah.
the situation is right now in most elections you have a zero-sum game, which
Yes.
means if I take voters away from my opponent,
Yeah.
I get them.
Yes.
For the most part, or they stay home, which is just as good for me. If I've got multiple parties, it makes me much less likely to engage in a negative attack because it hurts me just as much, or not as much, but I don't get the benefit of it. And so, to answer your question is, you still see that in party primaries. So like, for instance, what you have in the Donald Trump election is you had 17 candidates going to the post for way too long, and that there's all kinds of reasons why that happened. But the reality is no one was ever heads up with Donald Trump in the Republican primary, which means, and this is part of the reason they're having the realignment problem, they never got to pick their true Republican candidate because they never got heads up with Donald Trump. There was not even a single election where it was him against one opponent. And until you're one-on-one, you can't really hit. So the answer is that problem exists in the US as well. It just doesn't exist in the general.
So we have like a half hour left. These are awesome questions. We can look at, do you guys want to look at the spreadsheets? Do you want to look at the other data? Should we keep talking?
What website do you use for visualizations?
Oh yeah. Let me see which one that was. Let's see, where did I put that one? Because it's a good one, it's free.
It is
Tableau.
the Tableau? Tableau. Tableau public, yeah?
Yeah.
Which one is it?
Yes. Tableau. Do you guys use it too?
Yes.
What do you like doing with it?
Doing some interactive visualization for our data project, and also as I think it's a very good instrument for visual analysis.
Yeah.
Because if you have lots of data, it's very useful to see the visualization and to find some insight visualization. So Tableau is a very good and useful instrument for visual analysis, and but it needs to to be, so you need to prepare your data for Tableau especially, because if you use your data as a common format like Excel, you will not be able to perform it in Tableau in all times. So you need to transform your Tableau. She's a bit.
So do the work on the front end, but then it's, yeah,
Yes.
yeah. Yeah. Anybody else? Do we want to look at the data?
Yeah.
Yeah? Do you want to look at the spreadsheets, or do we want to look at the raw data?
Both.
Both? Okay. So what's best? Do you guys want to look at them individually? Should we look at them collectively? Should I share them on the Facebook group? Sure, here? Okay.
So again, just one of them.
All right. So. Do we want to look at the ISIS arrest or the EPA travel?
EPA travel.
EPA travel?
Yeah, that sounds like a great idea, yeah.
Let's see. Stefan, is your email pulled up here?
Yeah. It's in the bottom left.
You guys hot? Yeah, it's really hot, right? So have I downloaded something? Where is it? It's good to have tech support. Yeah. I wanted to download this. Mary? Alright. So this is our EPA travel document. And so this is the one that we had to do a little bit more analysis on to try to figure out what was what. So, let's see. So, all right. So we have here the location, and then we have notes. We have dates. And then we have little descriptions. And so with this one, what we just needed to do, these are just the ones for Oklahoma. And the reason that we broke out Oklahoma specifically was because this particular administrator was spending a lot of time in his home state. And this is something that the Inspector General was looking at, just to see why is he spending so much time in his home state. So this is why we looked at this one specifically, and we wanted to look and see what he was doing with each of these. And this is the description that he gave us for each one, that his office did. So that's that one. Seems pretty self-explanatory, right? Make sense? Any questions about this one? Maybe? No? Okay. Let's see. Let's look at the ISIS for us.
Actually, I have a question on this.
Yeah.
Sorry to come in late.
No?
You're presumably looking for gaps as well.
Mm-hmm.
There is no data. You would expect there to be some.
Yeah.
You know, what happened that morning, the interview or the meeting that was not put in the formal record?
Yeah.
How do you, that's, how, you know, if you think there is something missing and the story is in what's missing,
Right.
you know, every Wednesday afternoon there's something that's not in there, we know he's not on the golf course.
Right.
That's sort of difficult with a lot of tools like Excel to analyse the thing that's not there.
Right.
So it's very good for analysing what's there. Is that just a manual process for, you know, putting a gap in or putting an entry that says unknown?
Yeah, that's more of a manual process, and then working human sources.
I see. So it is quite a labour-intensive thing.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So there's no magic shortcut that you know of that I don't.
I don't know of any magic shortcuts.
Okay.
All right, so these are our ISIS guys. I say guys because I don't think we have any women. So let's go to 2014. So this was like basically these were the first ones who were arrested, basically. Oh, there is a woman. Look. Obstruction of justice. So yeah. So here we have the dates. Can you scroll across and see what we have on this side? Like in the, if you want to go here. And here we have just a little description of what it is they were arrested for. And this is something that we haven't, this is some data that we haven't yet. I would like for us to do a story on this, but it's going to be something that requires a lot more reporting. But what you see with a lot of these terrorism investigations in the United States is this thing called a confidential source and an undercover agent. So do you guys know what a confidential source is? Like, basically what this means is that law enforcement has someone on the inside that is talking to this terror suspect. So sometimes what it will be when you read the charging documents is it will say like, confidential informant made contact with the suspect on an ISIS chat room. They started talking, and then you read the documents and it turns out that the confidential informant gave this suspect bomb parts or something. And so confidential informants are involved in a lot of these terrorism prosecutions in the United States. And there's a real question about whether or not the person who was convicted of these charges had the motivation to carry out a crime before the confidential informant got involved. So what you see with a lot of these is confidential source, undercover agent. Can you scroll across? Here's what they tried to do. Wanted to be an ISIS bride. Oh, God bless her. That's really not wise. That is a bad idea. Members of a church group contacted authorities because they were suspicious. Tried to travel overseas to join ISIS, tried to travel overseas. Where did they come from? Gender. So these are, this data set is a little bit more complicated, as you can see, because there's a lot more information contained in each one of these cells that could have another story, right? Like the ISIS bride could be a great story. I'm kind of curious about her, right? Why did she want to be an ISIS bride? It's really weird. Then can you go to 2017? What you see here is a lot of these cases are ongoing. So these guys have all pleaded not guilty. But look here, confidential source, confidential source, confidential source, confidential source, confidential source, undercover agents. And these guys, can you scroll this way? Okay, so this is something that we may see more of. So this guy came to the U.S. from Uzbekistan. So most of these people are from the United States. That's what our data found. They're Americans born in America, from America. But this Uzbekistan guy, you scroll down. Yeah, citizen of Uzbekistan. So we've got two. So this is something, and obviously Uzbekistan is not covered under the travel ban. So that's another area of interest, right? But we're going to start seeing more of these stories about the Uzbek community because you have now two. So that'll be a story. So that's the other thing that's sort of interesting from this data set is you can sort of pick out what's going to be a story in the future, right? Make sense? Interesting? No?
Yes.
Yeah?
Yes.
Okay. Any questions?
There is a word like, I don't know, say a term, one of the aggressive FBI interview.
Yeah.
Can their interview consist of aggressive and polite?
That's a great question. That's a really, really good question. Thank you for that question. Right, because like what FBI agent is like, excuse me, sir, are you a terrorist? Right, so that's a really, really good question. And I actually, if I was editing a piece that said like, there was an aggressive FBI interview, my question would be like, how aggressive? I mean, really, like, are we talking about something that we need to look into more? Did this FBI agent cross a line? Did the FBI agent violate some law?
Yeah.
Because you're absolutely right. Like, you would kind of assume that like any FBI interview with a terror suspect would be aggressive. That's a really, really good question. I would have to ask the person who put that data in what they meant by that. That's a great question. Any other questions? So this is the guy from Uzbekistan. Killed 8 people in a truck attack. That happened on Halloween. That was really horrible. So then, let me email you this. So the other thing that, we haven't looked at this data yet, but this was the data that I was telling you about that like an NGO looked for. Let's see. So I'm going to forward you some links. Yeah. I'm going to forward them to you.
I have one question.
Yeah.
Do you have comparative analysis of how many from the listener, from citizens of the United States, and how many citizens of other countries
Like in general?
in general? Because sometimes you, in media, sometimes you say, oh, it's we are foreigners and the immigrants make a sense, but at the same time, a lot of United States citizens make the same things, horrible things.
So, yeah.
That happened last year, for example, in cinema. I don't know in which state, but it was happened and it was died maybe 6.
You know, there's a really big debate in the US right now about the definition of the term terrorism. So, for CNN, we define terrorism as an action carried out, an act of violence carried out against a civilian population with a political aim. So, for instance, the US has a lot of mass shootings. There was that horrible shooting in Las Vegas. I mean, 60 people killed. I mean, we have no idea yet why that guy did what he did. We don't know. We don't know the motivation. There's a lot of Americans who say, how is this not terrorism? Because citizens are terrorized, right? I can understand where they're coming from with that. That's not the definition that CNN has ever used. That's not the definition that authorities in the United States use. But you're absolutely right. Even when it comes to the definition that we would use for terrorism, and the definition that American authorities would use, the piece that we published on the ISIS arrests and the travel ban, what we found was yes, the majority of arrests are Americans. The majority, and the majority of them are seeking to go overseas. So it's almost like the U.S. is exporting as opposed to importing, right? So yeah, that was our conclusion as it relates to, because there's lots of kinds of terrorism, right? All it is a political aim. So there's a lot of focus on terrorism that is done in the name of Islam. But of course, there are like somebody was asking me about a terror attack that happened in Atlanta, where I used to live. And the guy who carried out that terrorist attack was a white guy, American for many generations, his family, and he was motivated by his Christian faith, right? So we do publish those stories. I think that is one of those areas where emotion and data perhaps conflict a little bit. But we do publish those stories, and I think it's a really important question.
So does CNN never revisit its definitions? Say terrorism, the person on the street thinks I'm terrorised by this. Is somebody going to try to do the same? I don't care about why, I just care about whether my child's going to be killed.
Right.
Does CNN ever say, are we still using the right definition? This word has a very powerful word in the English language. You sort of have to be careful how you use it, don't you?
So that's an ongoing discussion. And one of the reasons that I love working at CNN, and I mean, it's a big organization. There are certain things that we do that I think are great. There are certain things that I would argue with. But one of the reasons that I love it is because there is internally a very robust discussion always about the way we cover things, how we cover things, can we do better. When it comes to terrorism, there is a robust discussion.
Okay.
There are some people that feel like we overuse the term. There are some people that feel like we underuse the term. It's a word that has a lot of power because, especially in the American context, normally when something is labeled terrorism, there is a military response. We have been fighting a war on terror since 9/11. So when something is labeled terrorism, it's the biggest response from our government. It is a military response.
Yeah.
And so the word carries a lot of power.
Yeah, because I'm thinking the parallels being from the UK in the 80s, regularly bombs set by the IRA, but that's domestic. Northern Ireland is part of the United Kingdom, and it's the definition is different historically for us.
Yeah.
Even though it's the same word we use the same dictionaries with a different feeling when you use that word than when it's used by the American media, the
Of
American
course.
public.
Of course.
Two nations separated by a common language. Is that the expression? Or divided by a common language, which I see quite regularly. You know, I know many more Americans here than I do in London. It's very interesting how differently we think and how differently we use our shared language. And that would be quite interesting for somebody who's not a native English speaker to actually, you know, observe perhaps a conversation between American and Brits and us having to explain terms to each other. Hang on, I thought you guys spoke the same language. Sort of.
Yeah, of course, because language and culture are.
And that feeds into your non-quantitative data.
Yeah.
You know, it's your question about the FBI interview. You know, about what does that word mean? You know, the aggressive interview.
Right.
The context of it. Because I'm not a journalist. I work in IT. That's why I'm comfortable with the spreadsheets. I'm interested in how companies can be better at doing what you journalists do, which is looking for a pattern, finding the story, and then acting on it. Because most corporates are terrible. You guys could run training courses on, you know, how to interrogate your data better. And the quantitative stuff is quite easy.
Yeah.
It's the other stuff that's hard. It's the interviews and surveys and, you know, getting people's calendars and trying to pluck out, you know, the interesting bits. That's just not numbers in a spreadsheet. You hit F11 in Excel. Oh, look, there's a graph. Job done. Right, go to the pub now. It's a very different skill, and it's one that in IT we're not very good at.
Yeah.
I'm quite interested in that side.
Well, I think it depends on the motivation too. I mean, like if you're doing something for a company, like probably the motivation is to do an efficient job.
Yes.
And to make sure that the company continues to make money.
There's an easy. Does it make us money?
Yeah.
Does it save us money? You know, does it de-risk? That's the other thing. The methods to do it should be the same.
Yeah.
You know, you can go through a database and you can say, you've got a problem with this team over here, haven't you? And they say, really? And they go and investigate. Well, yeah, you're right. We do have a problem. How did you know? Well, I looked at the numbers.
Yeah.
Looked at the data. And that's exactly what you're doing, isn't it? But it's not very common in corporates, but it's standard in journalism. There's a crossover there that I'm quite interested in.
Yeah. Yeah. Let's see, where are we time-wise? Okay, we have 10 minutes. This has flown by. Has it been useful to you guys? Interesting? Yeah? Is there anything else I can share with you guys that would be more useful? You should not feel shy. You should ask me if there is something. Yeah.
Can you tell a little bit wider, how are you collecting this information, different facts, how it is organized in your team? Because it's very interesting how different teams are organizing and so on. Are you personally involved in making these spreadsheets, or are you just using it for some reasons and so on?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And like in some ways I wish one of my other colleagues were here because I don't put together these spreadsheets. What I do for the network is I come in after someone has put in the spreadsheet or whatever reporting tools they're using, and I interrogate them. So I sort of interrogate my colleagues and say, I think it's a friendly interview. I don't think it's an aggressive interrogation on my part. But what I say to them is, what conclusions did you reach? Why did you think this? What are you missing? You know, so for instance, for the EPA travel, I looked at their document and I said, okay, I think the assumptions that you've made are right. I think that the way you categorize this is right. But the way that CNN, at least CNN Washington, is divided is that we're divided along what we call beats. So we have a crime and justice. We have a regulation beat, which is worried about the EPA and these other kinds of Department of Energy. We have a travel and transportation beat. We have a congressional beat. We have a White House beat. And we also have a team that's working on the Robert Mueller investigation. So the special prosecutor's investigation into whether or not there was collusion between the Trump campaign and any Russians in the lead up to the election. So each one of those teams does their own information gathering, and then when they're ready to publish, then that's where I come in. And so I'm like the last step before they publish. Yeah. Anything else?
What do you do if you have, let's say, a good story,
Yeah.
but in the world there happen so many things,
Yes.
you are afraid that your story might not get noticed because there are bigger events out there?
That is such a good question. That is such a good question. So I worked for 3 weeks with a team who worked for a year on a 5-part series about Silicon Valley and the way in which Silicon Valley, like the power that Silicon Valley has over expression and speech online. It's a great series. They talked to a bunch of CEOs, they talked to conspiracy theorists, they talked to women who had been sexually harassed, it was a really, really good series. And so I worked on it, one of our lawyers worked on it, I mean we had and then it published on the Monday that the first indictments came down from our special prosecutor, Robert Mueller, in the United States. So, I mean, this was huge news. That was Monday. Tuesday, there was a terror attack in New York. And, I mean, what can you do? I mean, especially with something like that, they had planned it for so long, and, we had the wonderful designers who had built all this beautiful stuff, and it's a great series. I would encourage you all to look it up. It's called Divided and Code. But yeah, I mean, that happens all the time, and especially it seems like in the past year, there's no slow news days. Every day feels like a year.
Yeah. I was asking because when I was working with a company that developed an application to detect skin cancer, we planned launches in the countries that are especially targeted and where more people are exposed to this type of cancer. For example, Australia and New Zealand, where there's very high quantity of UV radiation also. And when we were ready to make the big launch that was planned for 3 months, a terrorist attack happened. And we felt like we don't want to also push this launch a little bit further, but can you revive something of that story, or is it better to try to relate it to something that is happening always, so you have a context and you're not out of the space?
Yeah, so we would call that a news peg.
News peg?
A news peg.
Okay.
Yeah, so it's always good to have a news peg because journalists can sometimes have a very limited attention span. And an audience can have a very limited attention span too. So it's always good to have a news peg. Like something like that, I would struggle to find a news peg, but I'm sure there is one. And the app sounds really cool. In the industry, we call it an evergreen because skin cancer is going to be a problem as long as there's sun. So the app sounds really cool. I think that is one that you would probably want to hold, even though you planned everything. I mean, if I were making that decision, I would go with it because it is everything. Yeah, that's cool. It's a good question.
Thank you.
Yeah, a lot of people have been in that situation. Yeah. So I think we're almost done. You guys are awesome, and I feel so privileged to be here with you guys. Any last questions on the way out? I hope this was interesting, useful. If there is something else that you want or need, or I know this was pretty general. If you have more specific questions, maybe I can't answer them. but maybe one of my colleagues could. If you have something like that, please don't hesitate to ask. Like, this is a really awesome opportunity for us all to be in the same space together. There's like, I don't know, 7 or 8 or 9 countries represented here. A bunch of different industries. It's so cool.
Actually, I have a question. It's not actually yeah, it's a question. So, when you just decide that okay, the data that you collected is enough to start the investigation, to start to analyze this. Because, for example, as a journalist, for example, I got it's not exact, but so when I look at the US, what happened in the US, for example, I just divide these events like that. For example, there was a mass shooting, terrorists attacking the US before the travel ban goes on. There was a terrorist attack from the country, from the person who came from other countries, foreigners. But after the travel ban, we saw that there is no local people started the mass shooting, like Las Vegas and the school shooting. There was a school shooting
in California.
So so when we analyze this data and we say that there is two groups who confront each other. One side who are against the travel ban, and the other side wants to keep this travel ban. So if this three, for example, data is enough to come conclusions, or it's not enough, how you can come conclusion that this data that we collected is enough to start our investigation?
I think it's enough to start an investigation.
To analyze. So
yeah, I would say it's not enough to publish.
Is that enough?
It's not enough to publish. Because much like the election, there's a lot of other factors, right?
Yeah.
So, I mean, for me, I would say, yeah, there's definitely enough to look into. There's a lot of information there, but it's probably not enough yet to publish anything. That's what I would say. And I would hope, I mean, unfortunately, there'll probably be more data for you to analyze on that one. Unfortunately, the US really has a problem when it comes to mass shootings. Yeah. So on that somber note, thank you guys so much. I'm around, so please find me if there's something else you want to talk about. Yeah, I really appreciate you guys being here.